It is a very dangerous job. There are serious risks of injury and death in different scenarios. There are challenges that men are experiencing in the workplace that also have tangential impacts on other people as well. And so what we're now trying to have the conversation is, how do we marry psychological safety culturally with what we're doing culturally on the physical safety?
Welcome to Ore-atory, Elevating Mining Minds. This is a podcast where we explore bold ideas, fresh thinking from the people who drive transformation in mining. Today, our episode takes on a big question. How do we build safer, stronger, and more inclusive teams in an industry still shaped by traditional ideas of toughness and resilience? Here to help us unpack that, we're joined by Trevor Mayoh, a leader working across mining, construction, and energy to foster culture change that starts with, rather than around, men. Trevor believes that when men are invited to the conversation early and in the right way, they don't resist change, they lead it. He's here to show us how psychological safety isn't just about compliance, it's about performance, well-being, and leadership at every level of the organization. So, welcome, Trevor.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very excited for our episode today. As many of you know, I always have offline conversations, and so leading up to this, sort of wish that we had recorded our conversation, but here we are. We get to repeat it and potentially do an even better job today. So what is getting you excited about your work at this point, Trevor?
So I've been doing this for a while, going into male-dominant spaces and having the conversation around equity, and it's morphed over quite some time. And I was thinking about this the other day. It's about how we used to encounter so much more resistance in the workplace. When you'd go in and say, hey, let's talk to men and have a conversation about what men's role is and what's impacting them, things like that, you'd get resistance from the men, from saying, rolling their eyes, not wanting to be there, not thinking it's a priority, not thinking that they're stakeholder and involved in it. But then you'd also get resistance from other groups within the workplace too, saying why men? It's particularly equity-seeking groups in the workplace, saying, and I mean valid critique as well. And so I think what's getting me excited right now is that you have people in all areas of business actually wanting to talk around equity, wanting to talk about mental health, wanting to talk about workplace culture, wanting to talk about what everybody's role is and their impact in it. And that's different. And it's no longer just sitting within HR. It's no longer sitting within one specific group. Wellness group, you're getting senior leaders, C-suite people, board members, people through all walks of the organization who are starting to lean in. And I think that's pretty exciting, because that was not the vibe 10 years ago when you were talking about this type of stuff in the workplace, whether it be corporate or on site. And it's pretty exciting to see that culture shift throughout the entire business so much in the last few years.
I absolutely agree, and I think you really articulated that nicely, that there's all of a sudden an audience, there's a platform for this, both at site and in corporate. And I've certainly seen it. We've spent a lot of time talking about it. I think I'm seeing it happen more organically through conversations at conferences with all different kinds of groups, right? And I think to have that sort of undercurrent of enthusiasm is really, really nice. And so I'm excited to sort of unpack some of that with you today. I think part of what we see so often is that people create employee resource groups or, whatever it might be out there around minorities and others. And you're sort of saying, let's tip this on its head and start with men who arguably, are the bulk of our workforce, at least in mining. And so not breaking that down into smaller groups, but it's really interesting that that's your perspective. After you explained it to me, I absolutely got it. But let's go into that a little bit.
Yeah, when you think about a workplace and really what we're trying to achieve in terms of creating more equitable, safe, and successful workplaces for everybody of all identities, and people build a workforce that also reflects the community in which they work, the customer in which they're working with. Cool. And then you have ERGs or other groups who have really said, okay, X group or X lived experience or identity is underrepresented, or they might face significant barriers in the workplace that aren't, and we need to bring sponsors and all that. And that's been fine and dandy. But one of the big challenges are there, as you mentioned, is one of the largest stakeholders that crosses a lot of different groups are men. One of the biggest demographics of people who hold structural power within a workplace, positions of authority, men, that hold a lot of social power, that hold a lot of the customs, the unwritten rules, the norms, helpful and bad, are held and set by men. And so they're a group, obviously, that we want to engage as stakeholders in the change. But I think one of the things where we haven't really sort of had the conversation fulsome is like not just as stakeholders of change, call them and say, hey, you need to do something for X, you need to be involved for other people, but seeing themselves and saying like there are challenges that men are experiencing in the workplace that also have tangential impacts on other people as well. And so if you think about it in a workplace right now, and you think about like some of the challenge that exists, so like let's say microaggressions or other like challenges to psychological safety or unconscious biases that float around, or even frankly conscious biases that float around. And if you pull that back and you start to say like, how do we actually engage that? What are the biggest demographics that sort of work on that? And some of that is how can men be involved in that conversation? And so we have the conversation around men's mental health and saying, listen, guys, like you can look around right now and say being told that you're privileged, you have all these elements of power, which is very fair. But then when guys think about that themselves, being like, well, I don't feel that way. I feel really challenged in my relationship at home. I feel the financial pressures of my income versus what I need to do for my kids or what have you, like my housing, all these different things that they're feeling. And if you go through some of the other stats where men are disproportionately impacted by suicide, women complete more, but women attempt more, men complete more. Men are disproportionately impacted by opioid overdose and addiction. Men are disproportionately impacted by incarceration, homelessness. When you start to go down a lot of the things, men live 4 to 5 years in Canada on average less than women, and that's not just because we have a different heart or something. It's because the vocation, the jobs that we choose, we are not proactive about our health, a number of different things that contribute into that. So when you start to go down all these things and be like, wow, there's a lot of challenges that are impacting men personally and in the workplace around this and those rigid norms. And the word that a lot of people sort of say, the patriarchy, sort of gets people fired up. But what we can really boil that down to is just the social system that we have is also killing and harming men too. Quite literally killing and harming. And so if we start to say, guys, if you start to lean in a little bit more around your mental health and start sort of dismantling some of the things that whether it be the stigma, the norms, whatever it may be, the programming that we have that sort of lead into some of those things that are harming us, that also is creating a safer, more equitable space for everybody in the workplace. It's creating an environment. If you create more psychological safety in that space, that means it is much easier for other equity-seeking groups to show up as their authentic selves and find success in an authentic, meaningful way in the workplace. And so it's a bit of a dance around to do it, but it really is about like engaging one of the biggest stakeholders that we have in our workplace and in culture, and the dominant narrative that controls a lot of the power structurally and socially, and starting to say like, hey, like what is your role and what's in it for you in a meaningful way to be an active stakeholder in challenging that. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of success. And it's not men versus everybody else. Like one of the biggest groups that want to have this conversation are women ERGs. Women ERGs are saying like, hey, we need to engage the men. We need to have a conversation about men, with men, for men. And so they're one of the biggest activators and allies in this space. So it's not about pitting against, it's just recognizing a demographic that also needs to be engaged in a really strategic way.
Well, and I love the idea that we can be allies, right? And that often we're asking for the opposite, but really, starting at this point and creating that buy-in and figuring out how we can support them and vice versa. Women seek out other women and groups all of the time to support themselves. And so I think it's really a powerful thing to start with one of the largest stakeholders, as you're suggesting, get them bought in and feeling supportive, and they can't help but have some enthusiasm to push it forward is my guess and my thought, because they recognize the huge amount of relief and gains. And we could use more technical terminology, the psychological safety factor and general overall happiness, but something else I think that this translates into is their ability to utilize it not just at work but at home and in friendships, and like that ripple effect outward is just really, really cool.
Well, yeah, so if you think everyone has a different sort of core motivation for why they're there or why they're connecting. So you could talk to someone and say, like, I don't care about my work. I'm literally just here for financial. Like, I'm here for that paycheck. That's my only motivator. You have other people who are there to build connections with, like, the challenge or what have you. Other, like, no matter what you go down, or you go into the social, they really want to have strong bonds, or they want to have better interpersonal relationships with their partner or their kids or what have you. Or you go expand out and be like, they just don't want to feel that anxiety, that mental health challenge or isolation or what have you. Like, no matter what someone's core motivating factor is, engaging in this type of work meets one of those needs. So if it's about, like, hey, I just want to have better relations, I want to challenge the norms and that I grew up with my own family, and I want to do some of that on programming so I can be a better parent or more engaged partner or what have you, great. Doing some of this works helps serve that. If you're like, I just want to be a better leader and be able to support and pull the levers that actually gets the best out of my team, amazing. This type of work actually does that. If it's you just saying, like, I just want to feel healthier at the end of the day, this serves that. Or frankly, if all you care about is your paycheck, this serves that. This is going to help you make bonus. Yeah. This is going to help you be a more high functioning, high performing team. And so no matter what the motivator is, and that's the cool part of this conversation, is it's not about like a zero sum saying that, hey, you need to give something up to give it to somebody else. You need to give up your time, your energy, your resources, whatever, for someone else's benefit. And instead, it's saying, you have a really direct return on investment to this. It's not just about other people and other circles who you should care about, but it's also about, like, you have an absolute direct benefit to engage in this type of conversation and work, no matter what your core motivator is. And I don't necessarily think that applies for all the type of stuff we do in the workplace, that it potentially has an impact on your parenthood, it potentially has an impact on your relationship. And that's the neat thing, is just how do we engage people to find out what is their core motivator so that we can actually navigate what that return looks like for them.
Well, how do you do that?
So a lot of it is just starting to ask, like, why, right? Like, you have corporate values, and but like, they're boilerplate, like, cool, like, some people can name them off, they're always similar, but sometimes it's just for yourself navigating a little bit more of, like, what brings me here, what do I care about, what are my values. But then if you're talking to other people, like, one of the things, if you think about it, if you go to a dinner party or something and the first thing you ask them is, like, what do you do, like, what's your job? We define ourselves by our vocation, by our job. And so if you start asking some of the people in your own circles, like, tell me about yourself, but don't mention anything to do with job. People panic. People have, like, you can literally see people, like, go like white in the face for a second, and they have a hot panic. But if you just start practicing that, so you do that with members of your team, you do that socially, you do all that, it is this test where people have to think about, like, okay, like, what do I care about? What, like, is it my family? Is it my hobbies? Is it, like, maybe something I volunteer? Like, people have to start analyzing that. And what's neat about that too, it's also an exercise in testing psychological safety of the people around you too, because it may change day to day on what they want to share or what have you. The third person in the group who shares is often different from the first, because the first person was, like, talked about their family, and someone's like, oh, I can talk about my family. Someone may have talked about their mental health, be like, oh, we can share that. And so that's really where you start to get where people start to understand more about values and less just about, like, their corporate identity, and people share what feels authentic to themselves. So when I go into a workplace, like, I already have some thoughts preloaded just by best practices by all the workplaces and the people I'm working with. But then it's literally just about being like, why are you here? And I'm not your boss, so you don't have to give me a loaded answer, but it's like, why are you here? Sending money back home, like, provide. I'm here because, like, I really like this. I love I'm an engineer, blah, blah, blah. This is what I want to do. I want to work with my hands. All these, whatever it is, why you're here, great. Like, let's unpack that further and figure out how this can actually aid in that for you. Because lastly, just on a tangent here, but, like, one of the biggest challenges that a lot of guys have when you talk about this, they view this type of work as selfish or not a priority. And so if we can start to connect these conversations back to things that are a priority to them, then it becomes a lot easier for them, not for us to convince them, but for them be willing to actually engage in the work and the conversation. And so the selfishness, that's another whole, like, beast to unpack, but at least being able to connect back with really what's important to them, then it's not something that's happening off the side of their desk. It's not something that they'll deal with when they can get to it. It actually is really important in terms of what their core motivator is.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I have found myself saying like, oh, I can't do this. I can't make this investment in myself, or I can't, and I think that men do that also. They're like, I should be focused. I should have the answers. I should know what I'm doing and how to support all of this stuff. And sometimes it's hard to give ourselves permission or to tie that back to, as you're saying, some of the core values, so that we can say it is worth the investment, it's worth the time, we can do it, and then see all of that come to fruition. But I think, it's a great tactic so that not just men, but all of us can sort of say, hey, this is important, and let's invest some time in it. One of the other things I think we talked about in our last call was sort of around this idea that, at least in mining and some of the heavy industry, that we've embodied safety across the board, and we talk about it all of the time. But that's impacted by our ability to feel psychologically safe as well, and how all of that comes to fruition. I mean, we preach every single day at safety meetings, we all have to go home with all of our parts and pieces and a safety share and all the rest of this stuff. Part of how I think we can make organizations better is by truly leading with some level of empathy and vulnerability, and leaning into creating the psychologically safe places so that they can also be safe. Because if you could admit, I'm tired, I have a new baby at home, or I'm stressed out, or whatever, and I can't do all of this today, that impacts everybody's safety around you. But that's a vulnerable thing to say, that's personal, and a lot of people, men specifically, I think, don't always come to the table with that. And so if we embed this in some of what we do every single day, I think that inherently we're creating a better environment for this to sort of take off from. And I don't remember we talked about that or not, but that was my soapbox moment.
Well, and it's great because when in this industry, physical safety is the most important thing. Going home safe and healthy at the end of every single day is like, and it's not just a speech that's like put on a board in the lunchroom. Like, it is really embodied by everybody who shows up, because there are it is a very dangerous job. There are serious risks of injury and death in different scenarios. And so it's something that people really feel. And one of the things that we're now trying to say is like, policies exist there, but people make that policy real through culture. Culture is people. It's not about a written piece of paper or something that you sign on your first day of work. And so what we're now trying to have the conversation is, how do we marry psychological safety culturally with what we're doing culturally on the physical safety? And I'll give you a few quick examples. So like when I go on site and I'm in a corporate office and like walking upstairs, and it's like, hey, Trevor, like 3 points of contact. And literally got called out in an office when I was going through, and you're sort of like, what? Like, but they're like, that's right. Like, these are the protocols that are really important, and it's not just on a piece of paper. They embody it, they believe it, and like, you practice it there as you practice it somewhere else. And so that's really cultural. Or the same thing, like I was up at a site and like, I'm waiting to cross to pick up my car, and it's literally across a laneway, and there's we're in the middle of nowhere, and I can see for miles and miles in both areas. So like, if a car is coming, I'll see it 5 minutes before it gets to me, but I have to wait for that light. And someone's like, no, you're waiting for the light. And I'm from Toronto, so like, that was, to me, it was just like I'm going to cross this road. It was like, no, we have to wait for the light. And so you're sitting there for a while, just being like, wow, like, this is really culturally felt by people. Or like, and these are guys that like, when they leave the site and they go home, like, they're not putting on seatbelts because the government can't tell them what to do, or they're not putting on like the oxygen mask first before helping somebody else in their own personal life or social life. But at work, the physical safety is so embodied. And so the way I think about that though too is like, that is not just through policy, that's through like the unwritten rules and communication of when you come onto site about where people are. And so around psychological safety, our conversation now is saying like, how do we make that and recognize that as being married to the idea of physical safety, of safety in a complete term. And so it's like being able, as you mentioned, like be able to showcase some of your vulnerability, not as a weakness, but also as an opportunity to create a space where other people can lean in, where you can challenge things like microaggressions in the workplace and recognize what they mean and their impact to other people. You can engage in problematic behavior or biases that you may see. All of these different things sort of float together into a more mentally health space. And so this is something a lot of people are like, yeah, we get that. We should start having some of these conversations a little bit more. And back to your point again, like it does start with showcasing, because we have the policies, like the policies around psychological safety, harassment, all that stuff, they're there. It's now just about like, how do we take it off that page and make it real? And the biggest thing for someone, no matter where they are, if it's their first day on their job or they've been there for 20 years, is how do you show up and create the space for other people? And I was at a work site not that long ago, and it was a pretty diverse in terms of the age group that was there. And one of the guys, we were just chatting about this, and one of the guys stepped up and talked about how a friend of theirs was missing at that period of time, and just was like, hey, like I'm here, I don't need all this XYZ story like background, I don't need people coming over telling me, but just so you know, like my friend's missing right now, and that's a really weird situation for me to be navigating. And what was powerful about that, it wasn't the fact that like obviously people are like, wow, I didn't know you were dealing with that, I didn't know, wow, that's really a challenge. And they didn't try to be action oriented and try to say like, have you tried this, have you called this, blah 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 blah. It was, wow, just be like, wow, like that sounds like you're dealing with a lot right now. It was the fact that he created permission just by sharing that, and he felt safe and comfortable sharing that someone else was able to talk about a challenge that they had with their manager at some point, and said like, this was an uncomfortable conversation, I don't know if it was problematic or whatever, but they felt safe because someone else shared and created that space for them. Yeah. And so you mentioned things like safety meetings. Like there's a perfect example of, I mean, instead of just being like, oh, we saw a spill, we cleaned up the spill, we reported it. It is like, I took a moment to like, I don't know, like choose what's real to you. Like someone could say like, talk about breathing, or I could just say like, last night I took the night off of doing whatever because I needed the break, or like even today, like whatever, like starting to share and just create that space. And the call is not like when you pull a bunch of guys in the room and they're like, oh yeah, like I feel fine. Now we all know that's not statistically true, but like that's how they're feeling, fine. But the call is, even if you feel honky-dory, even if you feel like you have the best mental health that's ever existed and like you're amazing, then your job is to create the space for other people who are not at your level or are not in your space right now. And so your job is not done because you feel great. Your job is because you feel great and supported and safe and psychologically secure and blah, blah, blah. Then your job is, what are you doing to lead to create the space for other people as well? Yeah. And so that's where like the safety moments are really powerful, because you can have people around there being like, I don't really have a vulnerability to share like that I can think about, but it's taking that moment to be able to create the space for other people to lean in. And that's how we move it off the paper into being more real and cultural.
And I think, as you said, this is one of those parts where we really have to create that space for others to have those moments, even if you're unwilling or don't have anything at that very moment. Sometimes it's just creating the opportunity to support somebody that then allows them to see you that you're human, or teaches you to also have those vulnerable moments. And you know, it's interesting because several years ago, I mean, my dad is a baby boomer, and like I was raised in like a work scenario, and like a client calls, we do the work, like you just get it done, right? And you know, you figure out how to work better and differently as you move forward. But I had a client, and I was at a site visit, and I was traveling, and it was a long day, and they had asked for a call. And I said, well, I'm going to be getting off the site, and it's about 30 minutes if all goes well down, and I should get there, and I'll be able to hop on the call with you by X time. And for the first time in my career as a consultant, this individual who was male and senior was like, whoa, I didn't realize you were traveling, and I'm sorry that I threw our plan off, and you know, my urgency is not yours, and just get off and be safe, and you can ping me, and if I'm available, then great, we'll have the call, and if not, then we can just reconvene next week. And I was like, no, but you're asking me for a call, and it's urgent, and like I'm going to make this happen. And he was like, no, you're going to go and be safe and take care of yourself while you're traveling, and we'll just get to this later. And it was the first time from any specifically male leader that I had ever worked potentially for, and did for several years after that, that gave me the time and the opportunity to just say like, I need a moment to breathe before we launch into this. And it was great working with him, because he certainly did this with me, and he did this with others. And he built a great team around him. And every single time he asked me to help him fill a role. He would go through it. He would welcome everybody to the table. He had hiring teams. He just literally did everything right. And so at some point I said, hey, Chuck, where did you come up with this? And he was like, because every time I had a leader or a manager who didn't do these things, or when I recognized that I failed, I would write things down, like the wins, the parts where I could get better, and examples that I didn't want to have. And he was like, I just try to practice them. He's like, on a monthly basis, challenge myself to review this notebook, and I go back to it and like rethink through it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. But, even his teams were like, we have learned so much. He's a difficult manager, but he's fair and kind and open, and like we can be ourselves. And that was just such a powerful thing for me to see it in practice, even extending to a consultant where most of the time people are like, now, yesterday,
right.
like cheaper, better, faster.
And you can feel it, right? You can feel it. I mean, when you go in and you talk to people in the workplace and say like, think of the best job you've ever had. No matter what it is, if it was a part-time job, it was like when you were in high school, whatever, like think of the best job that you ever had and what made it the best job. And then think of, same thing, the worst job you've had and what made it the worst job. And then the secondary thing is like, think of the best leader manager you've ever had, what made them the best and then the worst. And when people start going through and start thinking about really what it is, and like for a lot of the people, the best managers saw them.
Yeah.
And whatever that looks like authentically in the relationship, but they were seen by their manager in some way, and they found a way to operate. And so that's really just a proactive, engaged move by a manager to create some level of psychological safety. And it doesn't just happen, it's intentional. And so your story is an example. I have one, a super transformative event for me was when I was in a workplace working as a staff member there. The manager, the leader of the organization, it wasn't a huge company, brought everyone together in a boardroom. And we'd sit together and we'd go around, and it was like a pulse check, like, hey, where are you at? Don't talk about your job, but how are you feeling? And I remember the first time, as it was going around the circle, before it got to me, being like, what the hell is this? and sitting there and being like, I just want to be back at my desk doing my stuff. What is So you offered up something like really like basic and move on. And then it happened again a few weeks later, and then again a few weeks later. And I think it was at the third time of us doing it that it got to me, hearing other people, coworkers talk about stuff. And I remember being like, what is going on? And it got to me and was like, you know what, like I feel pretty stressed right now, but I don't have any deliverables on my project. Like nothing is coming up at my project. This should be the easy chill time for me. And I'm feeling really stressed and rattled about that. And so like a bit to unpack there. And that was the kickoff to me then realizing, okay, like thinking a bit more of it, unpacking it more, taking it offline, learning, and leading me to be diagnosed with anxiety disorder. And then ADHD from there and things like that. And so it was a transformative moment for me personally, but it was also an absolutely transformative moment for me professionally and in my career as well. If like just understanding more about that, being able to lead in. But that didn't happen just because I rolled in one day. I was like, I'm stressed. Why am I stressed? It was because a leader intentionally created the space, offered up something for themselves, and did it repeatedly in creating that space. And it wasn't, as I said, like the first few times I was like, this is not for me. Everyone else here, go off. Good for you, but it's not for me. But it wasn't until the third time where I actually felt safe enough, intentionally, unconsciously, whatever, to actually lean in and do that. And so that to me is a really important lesson for other organizations too, is like do something that's authentic to yourself and your team and how you want to manage, but it's intentional. It is not a passive thing. It's something that you need to strategically think about, you need to invest time and energy into, and you need to showcase your own vulnerability in that endeavor as well. And it may not pay off for the first time and be like, well, this is silly, I guess it didn't work. Be like, no, like you need to sort of nurture it and create the space, and eventually someone will feel more comfortable leaning in their way as that goes. And so it can be a challenge, but we already in mining, we have so many cross points where that is something that organically can happen, with whether it be the shift change, whether it be at our safety meetings, whether it be when you're riding in the bus, like wherever it is, like we already have so many of those points where you can do that type of work. So it's not like this heavy lift that feels really weird and awkward, because we can incorporate it already into places that exist.
Well, and I love that example because, like you said, it wasn't the first, it wasn't the second, it took to the third. And I think sometimes we go out and on a limb and try something new intentionally, and we're putting things into practice, and when we're not immediately getting that like positive feedback loop, it's like, well, that didn't work, we got to do something else, like that was hard. But it is a practice, and so I think it's a really powerful thing to acknowledge that, you know, it may not be every time that you get something from one or all of the people that are at these meetings, but you have to lay out that opportunity to do it on a routine basis so that it's there if and when somebody needs that support, and
committing to it.
It's learning it. That's exactly right. So I love that example, and thank you for sharing it. And it's, you know, probably not one that everybody, you know, has gotten great feedback from, right? Like, I think that I've talked to individuals who say, you know, oh, we're going to incorporate something new, and then it just gets old really fast, and they just, you know, they don't follow through with it. And so it does take that continual practice to make it really work from my perspective.
Well, and if we boil back down to, again, people's values and all that, like when I talk to leaders, and I'd say leaders, it could be a manager, supervisor, shift leader, or it could just be a social leader. When I talk to them, like, they all care about it. They want to do right by other people. And so they just may not have practiced it. It may feel awkward. It may feel clunky. It may feel like weird, because it's just not something that like we've all grown up being programmed or taught to do. And so, but we want to do right by other people. And so if we genuinely care about other people, then how do we proactively show up for them? And some of that is committing and doing something that may feel weird, and then like, but commit to it more than once and create the space. And then if you really feel like, okay, maybe there's a better way of doing this, then pivot, but like give it some time. One of the things that it sort of irks me, so tangent on that for a second, is that like a lot of people will take sort of a passive seat to some of this conversation, but they think that, and it's really well intentioned, but they think, okay, we did it. So like as an example, like someone will say, you know, my door's always open. Yeah. Okay, cool. Like, and you think that, be like, oh, if anyone ever needs anything, like they're going to walk through that door and I'm going to be ready. I'm going to be on it. I'm amazing. But not necessarily recognizing what are all the burdens and barriers for someone walking through that door to lean into that space. And so that door's always open is great in theory, but in practice, people are not walking through to engage unless you're doing something else in that way as well. And a lot of that is like how you showcasing yourself or engaging out. Another sort of example is, you know, like everyone like has like this like awareness around like mental health and like depression, because there's big campaigns of talking about it, but we don't necessarily know how to engage with it. And so you'll have like someone who's in the moment of like a mental health episode really feeling low, and it's like 3 a.m, and like, you know what, like Cheryl from like high school posted on Facebook a few years ago that if I'm ever low, I should reach out. And, you know, Cheryl's really well intentioned, but like that's not how it works, right? Like someone's not thinking like, oh great, like that the isolation's real, like the distance and things like that. And so Cheryl really meant really well, like if anybody needs me, like I will pick up the phone, I'll be there at any point. But the problem is that's not how it works. So like Cheryl, like instead just leaning in and doing pulse checks with other people. Haven't chatted with you in a while, how you doing? Or even sometimes maybe on her own, like let's say Facebook is her medium, disclosing a little bit about like, today was a really challenging day, or like, wow, like this season was really difficult for me, but I'm really thankful for community, whatever like that. That is more about creating a space where other people will lean in. And if we even want to think about it even like on more basic corporate terms, like we saw in the last few years, a lot of people like pat themselves on the back when they would send an email and they put at the bottom being like, I know I'm sending this outside work hours, you don't need to respond to it until you come in. And they're like, we did it. But not recognizing the phone still dings on somebody's phone. And so even though you've sent that, someone who's more junior to you will still read it, mentally think about it. You've removed them from their personal time. You've now potentially, like, that's what they're going to think about all night. So what are you doing in terms of a psychologically safe environment, even when you're sending it? So instead of putting that blurb at the bottom, maybe you could just put it in draft until they batch out at 6 a.m. Right? Like, and so again, it's about like, how do we decenter ourselves sometimes from the conversation and start thinking about how things land or how things would actually be felt by other people? And if we genuinely care, then it's thinking about what are some of the barriers or what are some of the impacts on other people that on our team, other peers that we have, other people that we may have socially in our life too. And that's not an easy thing to do, but that's, if we're really trying to think about like small tools that we can do around psychological safety, like there's an easy first step that anybody, no matter who they are, can incorporate, just decentering and starting to think about people from other lenses.
Well, and I really love that you brought up some like practical, easy to implement changes, right? Because sometimes you would never have thought of it. And so you can borrow it from someone else and start incorporating it. The other thing that I really want to point out that I love that you said is that, if it's not working, you can pivot. Like, you may not know exactly what feels great to you or how to lead this meeting or how to show up for your team or whatever the case may be. But as you learn more and you can do better, it's okay to do that, right? And to change that course moving forward. And I think sometimes some of the obstacle to doing something new is that we don't have it all charted out perfectly. And I think specifically with highly technical individuals in environments like mining, they want to reduce that risk and understand what it's going to turn out to be. And, it's just not one of those things that's possible with this. And so it's sort of like, give yourself the permission to be a real human at work. And, for years and years, I've said, look, you have to show up authentically you, but being reminded of this, is sort of like, you can't show up authentically you if it's not a psychologically safe place to do so. And so you kind of have the chicken and the egg. You've got to start somewhere and start creating these environments. And I love the very implementable nuggets that we can all use, whether it's just delaying sending the email or, sitting down with somebody at lunch and asking a question and seeing if you can get them to talk. But, the hey, I'm here if you need it, or my door's always open, isn't exactly the way to incite, vulnerability from your team.
And this is also an exercise in building trust too, right? Like, if all of a sudden tomorrow you walked in and you're like, hey, we're going to have this emotional circle, and people have felt like there's friction or like whatever, you need to build some trust with people about where that goes. And that's the other thing, like, people also test, right? In terms of being like, okay, if someone shares something, people watch to see, okay, how's that used? Is that because there's this fear, over a third of men won't talk about their mental health in the workplace because they feel like it would challenge their career growth. So they would lose out on a promotion, and a similar number would actually feel that their job would be in jeopardy if they talked about it. So if you're thinking about it, a third of men are feeling that in the workplace, that they're not into all that. They need to see when other people can showcase that it's not coming back to harm them, either from an official standpoint or even just like socially in that environment. And so it does take some time to build that trust. And so that's also why when you're thinking about if someone's committing to something, is being like, it doesn't have to be hashed out. But if you come to it saying like, I want to do right by people, we're going to try to figure out a way of doing this, then you're afforded a tremendous amount of grace in that trust building exercise, because you're being on it about being like, we'll see how this goes. If at whatever length of time, like if we find like it's not doing what we wanted to do, then like let's chat about that. But like, at least you're offering up, like, we're figuring this out, I'm learning too as we go, and that authenticity is really powerful for other people to be like, okay, like, this isn't about having a finite answer. This is about like us just sort of figuring out what this looks like for us together as we go.
Well, one of the things as I was stalking you on your websites that you had mentioned in there was, I'm going to screw it up, something like 27% increase in performance in psychologically safe teams. And like, that's a huge amount of increased performance by just literally creating a scenario where people feel psychologically safe. And so in organizations that are so driven by metrics and numbers, and for something like this that's relatively inexpensive to implement, whether they're utilizing someone like yourself that comes in and coaches and develops these systems for them to use, or if they're just sort of chipping away at it, 27% is massive.
Absolutely. And then also like investment in mental health, also like the most conservative, like if you want to get super liberal, I think it's high, but the most conservative is like a 3 times return on every dollar invested in mental health in the workplace in terms of its return for the business. So like there are really good numbers here to support the case. The other thing is, like, if you think about what psychological safety means, like obviously being able to show up and be your authentic self, and then be able to contribute and have meaningful conversations as well. So if you think about it in both parts of that if you have a psychologically safe environment, then you have diversity in that environment as well. And that means not just diversity in what people think about like visual diversity, but it means there's diversity of perspectives. Think about other aspects of lived experience. So there's age, there's ability, there's people of different educational backgrounds. There's just true diversity in that environment. And so if you think about it, that means there's diversity of perspective and thought and experience that are tackling challenges. So you have more innovative solutions to challenges, quicker solutions because you have more people bouncing around. You stress test things in different ways faster. And so it's a way better product in that way. But then also if you think about it in other aspects too, about what that means, it means that people are able to disclose their vulnerabilities, and it increases trust, it lowers friction between individuals. Doesn't mean that you're gonna like hug every day and be best friends, but you find more effective and healthy ways to communicate, even if like you hate this guy or this person on your team or whatever, like you find psychologically safe allows you in a healthy and effective way to communicate. And so the communication becomes stronger, and so teams work better. So like when you go down most metric, people are not missing work, they're showing up, but also when they're showing up, they're actually performing. They're not like sitting there vacant or not operating at their full capacity. So when you go through all of the different metrics, it has a really, really good return. And like you can see that with organizations who have invested in it. And the thing for me is like, there's obviously stories. I know I mentioned it to you in a previous conversation around like I was working with a mining group, and like there was a younger guy who was starting on the team, and he felt safe sharing his perspective on like the orientation of a shop. And it was literally just in their shop where some of the stuff was set up, like the desk versus one of the tool, all that stuff. So it wasn't a huge thing, but he was sort of like, this doesn't make sense to me. I think we should try it this way. And so he felt safe challenging something where in other environments, other people would have been like, this is the way it's been done. You just don't know yet. Yeah, like you'll learn, you just don't know yet. They allowed that conversation. He felt safe sharing it. And then they tested it. And I can't remember the exact output, but it was enough that they were like, oh, this increased our efficiency throughout the day, that they made that permanent. And they actually brought it to other shops within their operation too, of saying like, hey, like, figure out, like, solve for some of these things. And so like that to me is like just such a small example. But when I was on site having that conversation, I was like, for them it had a really big impact, but it really was a psychologically safe environment where someone felt able to share. It does not mean that 100% has to be enacted. It just meant that they could share and they felt seen, and they were able to participate and go home at the end of the day feeling respected. And so that's an example. But then there's other like larger examples too, where like someone's able to say like, hey, like I'm not all right today, and today is not going to be a high output for me today. That not only is creating a better performance on psychological safety, it also allows leaders to better plan things out, make safety, like strategize around safety, things like that, or know like, hey, Tom probably is going to need things explained to him twice today, just because he needs that time to think through. So like it's not all about like, oh, we need to give an accommodation to so and so because they're going through a divorce and therefore like they need a break every half hour to cry. It's more about saying like okay, like maybe we need to spend an extra 2 minutes at the beginning of the day before we go out, when we talk about what our goals and outputs are, like just to say like, does everyone get it? Where energy levels, like it doesn't have to be this most severe version when we think about it, but it has a really big impact on the business. And just the last point on this, like when we bring it back to what we mentioned earlier, is like everyone has a motivator, and that could be a relationship, it could be whatever, all that. And the business has a motivator, and the business may have different lines in that motivation. So it's to increase profits. And so that maybe we need to invest in our workforce, we need to invest in technology, we need to whatever. So their interest is to increase profits and to grow, and that could be through a number of different things. And so on the people side, it's saying, okay, then what does an investment in people look like that helps us reach that end? And the investment in people on that is making sure that they're showing up safe and healthy and seen every single day and respected every single day. That allows them to not only come up with the new solutions, innovate, and push this product or business into the next level, but then it also means that as a human capital, they're showing up as their most effective selves to be able to perform. And so if we pull it back into the most business terms, it makes sense. And if we pull it into the most social, hey, I care for you, I want you to be healthy, I want you to feel good, it makes sense too. So it really does hit all the metrics on that.
And, I think a key word to drive that home to me is respect, right? And I think that what we're learning is that psychological safety and some of these scenarios in breeding some vulnerability, etc. Like you said, you don't have to agree. You don't even have to like one another. But if there's a foundation of respect and psychological safety, a lot can get done, and so many things can kind of just feel better, even if it's hard. And so I love that you sort of brought that back into perspective. I wanted to spend a little time, because like time is flying. We're already at, I don't know, 45 minutes or something crazy. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on your two companies. And so Equity Leaders first. And so, you know, we've talked around a lot of what you do, but then I kind of want to move into Next Gen, because it is very, very cool. And so instead of working in an organization level, that's kind of starting at the beginning for younger individuals to start learning some of these tricks and tools and eliminate some of this stuff, so that, you know, you're kind of getting it at the source versus having to fix it later on. And so if you can just give sort of a highlight of both of those, because I really, really love the idea for Next Gen. I know that I don't love Equity Leaders, but, you know, start with Equity Leaders.
Well, actually, what I'll do is so Next Gen Men is a not-for-profit based in Canada, but operates internationally. And it envisions a future where men and boys feel less pain and cause less harm. And one of the ways we do that is really challenge how the way that we see, that we act, and we talk about masculinity and what that looks like. Yeah. And so in that work, there's a lot of youth work, and I'll come back to that second. But one of the arms of that organization is working with workplaces in corporate spaces. And so that's where Equity Leaders comes in. And so Equity Leaders is where we bring that conversation about engaging men, having those conversations, what that looks like, into male-dominant workspaces. And so the Equity Leaders does a lot. So it, from keynotes to whatever, but the workshops to coaching, all that type of stuff. But really what it does is engage in male-dominant workplaces and meet people where they're at and having a conversation about, and help them get unstuck around this. And so that could be, as we mentioned, like the conversation around men's mental health and what that looks like, psychological safety, how to bring policy to culture, a number of things. And we use gender as an entry tool for broader initiatives. I mean, everyone has a relationship with their gender, and so they can see themselves in those conversations and understand what that looks like. And then if you make it more gender equitable and safe in the environment, in a workplace, then it also becomes more equitable and safe for other identities and experiences at the workplace. So that's Equity Leaders in terms of like the consulting in the workplace arm. Yeah. And then Next Gen Men, and that helps. This is the cool thing too about Equity Leaders. Next Gen Men does Next Gen Men does a tremendous amount of work in like schools. Yeah. We have some really innovative programming of like an online Discord server. So it's for masculine identifying youth to find a safe place online that's facilitated in community building online. We do rites of passage trips that bring people from offline into real life and bring them together. And they just went last month and did some through the Rockies and things like that. And so we do a number of different things, support for coaches in terms of how to mentor youth and have conversations around that, how we break some of those gender norms, and so it's all over. And the really neat thing is about Equity Leaders is, so while we're doing the work in the workplaces, we're having the conversation, we're doing these workshops, we're doing the behavioral and attitudinal conversations, we're doing all that type of stuff. And so the workplace gets the benefit of that work they're doing, but Equity Leaders funds Next Gen Men's work too. So it's like this really powerful double hit where the workplace gets to do the work, but then they're also funding having this conversation way upstream with youth as well. And so that it's neat to have that conversation in workplaces, but it's also incredible to have it in schools, to have it with parents, to have it in all these spaces. And then also one of the biggest things about Next Gen Men is really where are things going down the road? How can we innovate and find different ways of engaging and seeing and challenging some of the things around the norms and barriers for youth. And so that's where the exciting stuff really happens, is on the Next Gen Men side.
Well, I feel like you're reading my mind, because I was like, I love the idea of working with youth and learning from them as we become a little bit detached from what that really looks like as we get older, because it's a different experience than we had. And so doing what we do every day as professionals changes based upon their needs. And so if we can learn from them and show up in a way that actually supports them, and where we learn and get to be better, it's just such an empowering sort of loop that we get to experience. And, you know, I love that you're doing both, because I think that it's so incredibly needed. And, you know, as we feed this into equity and diversity across the board in so many different areas, you know, I think we sort of got a little EDI fatigue over the last few years, but you know, you haven't really said it in any of the terms that we're accustomed to, and I find that fascinating because I've had to start sort of rethinking how I incorporate that into my work as well, so that it's palatable. And you know, you're sort of integrating it into an array of different areas that you're doing, but from a very holistic fashion, like starting from a core area. Because if you demonstrate all of these areas, as you said, sort of naturally wind up having diverse populations, diverse ways of thinking. You're supporting an array of backgrounds and all of that. And so, you know, it's sort of magical when you think about it, how all of this can kind of come together at the end of the day.
It's neat too, because when you engage with youth, and like the number one thing that they want to feel is seen, and not talked at, but really heard and seen. And so how do you create spaces? How do you find innovative ways of having that conversation, recognizing the real challenges and what that looks like? And then when you go to adults, it's really the same theme, right? Of like, you want to be seen, you want to be heard, you want to be able to show up as your authentic self in that space. And so when we're talking with youth and engaging with youth, it's also about like recognizing, again, the theme same, it just manifests in different ways. Isolation, I mean, loneliness, lack, like that is a big challenge, particularly with digital platforms, with different things happening online, just with a lot of like some of these influencers online, they're preaching about like masculinity and things like that really does lead to isolation and loneliness, which is a challenge. And when you think about it later in life in workplaces and what that looks like, and the stats for men are quite dark when it talks about like how many of them actually have friends, how many of them have close friends as they age through life, and it becomes harder. So like, but one thing I do want to mention is the DEI thing, because I find it all relates back together. And so we stopped talking around DEI or naming it in that way a while ago, before the political sort of movement. And it wasn't because we're like, oh, we're afraid of the term, but really for us, I don't think DEI really did a great job of like sort of capturing how we actually challenge the environment to create some of the change. And so if we think about what some of the people's pushback or their issues with DEI as a concept, like the real DEI, not the political DEI, but like the real DEI as a concept, a lot of it is, it's being told to them, not with them. It's being spoken at them. They don't see themselves in it. They may feel, again, we can debate the reality on which this is based, but this is their feeling. They feel a lack of fairness, that opportunities, jobs, futures, whatever, are going to go to someone else, not me, not my kids. And so they feel like there's a lack of fairness there. They feel that the grounds are shifting, and they feel shame. They're being labeled with shame for something that they feel like they haven't done themselves, and so they're wearing the burdens of other individuals or history. And so when you pull back and you look at those, and again, we can debate the context and the reality or whatever, but frankly, that's almost irrelevant, because when you pull back to those feelings, then how do we challenge and engage those in a really meaningful way? So do we help that? How do we engage that vulnerability? And so when you're talking about people who feel like the lack of fairness, they feel like it's been happening to them, the other people are getting things, but they don't feel like their needs are being met, all that, then when you start to think about that beginning, when I say like, well, men's mental health is a really excellent entry point to having the broader equity conversations, because then men start to say like, the system that is harmful to other people is actually really harming us too. And so we can then start having the conversation around, okay, like, how do we make sure that you feel seen? How do you have some of these vulnerabilities sort of engaged? Like, you feel that things are happening to other people but not met to you, and around your mental health, that's probably quite accurate. So like, how do we have engagements on that? And when we start engaging some of those things, then we actually start hitting the exact same ends that we wanted when we were having the DEI conversation about creating a more successful workplace for all identities, one that helps remove the unique barriers that different lived experiences and identities have in terms of accessing and moving through different jobs and careers. And then we start to see real equity, not just real diversity in the space too. And so I think we made that pivot consciously to saying like, let's start looking at some of the root challenges and obstacles to that are not just dealing with like systemic challenges, but like really where the people who are holding those the power socially and in the workplace are feeling, and we've found a tremendous amount of success in that, because that's where a lot of the pain point is, and that's where a lot of the pushback has been on some of these broader initiatives in the workplace.
Well, and I see this in practice all the time, right? And not that long ago, I was actually at a big association here in the US, and a friend of mine was sitting on a panel talking about a lot of this stuff specifically. And there was an individual, and she leads, a group really focused for women. And there was an individual in the background, she brought up the idea of psychological safety. And, he was like, oh, like back in my day, this wasn't a big deal. And there wasn't support for it. But I thought, after talking to you, like he would be the prime candidate to explore this with, because even though there's resistance there, I think that there's so much opportunity as well. And when we've been talking about it in the ways that we have, where you've got, one group focused on women, or, somebody of a different, background culturally, or et cetera, rather than focused on them, it brings the point front and center, and they're capable of supporting it and seeing the benefits for it. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing in that space, because honestly, I haven't heard about it until now. I think that we have seen a push for specifically men's mental health, and we're certainly talking about it in a lot of the groups that I'm a part of. And I think it's very, very important knowing some of the statistics that we have in the mining industry specifically. But, it's just a really, I love what you're doing. I think that we need to see much, much more of it. But, for those of you who are watching, I'm just going to pop up Next Gen so that you have the links to it, and I'll follow up with equity leaders when this one pops off.
One thing I just really want to quickly mention is it is really easy for us to try to fall back into debate mode when you hear someone say something and be like, I'm going to debate that, I'm going to push back, that's not factually correct, blah, 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 blah. Like, It's really easy to do that. And instead, if we're really trying to meet people where we're at, I think one of the biggest things when we talked about decentering before in terms of like psychological safety, it's also really important for us to decenter in that moment and hear the feeling that someone's expressing there. Because you could also say, like, is this based on like a reality you've seen or a fear that you have? Can't really always say fear, sometimes, but like is like
that's
where
a reactive word at times.
Yeah, but like where is this actually coming from? So if we're actually interested in engaging, and it's also important for us to recognize that like everyone's at different points in their journeys. So like we can't expect someone who's just tipping their toe into this and starting to say like what's my role, what all that, to be on the front lines of knowing if all that, like we all have different points of where lived experience and what a relationship to this is. And so it's really about how do we meet people where they're at, and then recognize that everyone's going to have a unique journey in this. And if we're really interested in creating psychological safety, it's not about compliance to our worldview, but it's about creating an ability for other people to see other perspectives and hear other perspectives, and then be able to navigate and interact with those in a safe way, and build the capacity for them to do that. And that is a challenge for us who do the work sometimes, where you just want to be like, here's the stat, like I'm not debating it, like I'm right, you're wrong. Instead, it's like, no, like what is leading you to this frustration, this concern, this pushback, whatever you're having, what is the genesis of that? And then let's like go from there. And so anybody who's doing the work in the workplace or in your own circles, the biggest thing is like, how do you just decenter yourself in those conversations to really hear what is driving a critique, a concern, a pushback, or what have you?
Well, and I imagine that sometimes the responses could take some unpacking, right? And so guiding through that is also probably really sometimes difficult, but rewarding, I would assume, because they may say something and then realize what a big deal that actually is, and have to work through some of that. And so, I think it adds to a lot of empowerment when you can work through some of these things for them to gain momentum and traction and support others, because they recognize immediately, or after some work, if they're willing to do it, that this is super powerful.
The thing that just keeps bubbling up in my mind, that's thread through so many different stories or things that we talked about, is just like people wanting to be seen.
Yeah.
And if people want to be seen, and like people have problematic views or problematic perspectives, right? And so sometimes it's not about being like, you're wrong, leave, you're bad, whatever. It's more about like they want their like obviously like the way they verbalize it, there is a code of conduct line, we get that, but like it's more about like they want to be seen, like my frustration, my fear, like when someone says like I just want the best person for the job, I just want the strong, like as long as you can lift this, I don't care, we don't need different, blah, blah, as long as you whatever, like it's the myth of meritocracy. I'm not going to get into all that right now, but like when you boil that down, they just want to be seen about saying like I want to make sure that like I'm not losing out. I want to make sure that like I have a fair shot. I want to make sure that the people on my team are safe or whatever. Like it's really about what that is floating there. They just want to feel seen. So instead about being like you're problematic for saying that, how dare you, blah 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 blah, the response is really sort of like dealing in like I understand. Here's what's happening, here's where we're going, how does that align with what you're feeling, blah, 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 blah. And so like that's, if we're thinking of like something central for people to like activate in their day-to-day lives, it's just like, how do you make sure that other people feel seen in their work? It does not mean that what they say goes. So like, for instance, that really quickly, that reference I made about the person in the, like recognizing the workshop stuff, like that didn't have to be like, yes, let's do it. Like he could have said like, I think to do it, and they'd be like, the response could have been like, thank you very much for that. We're not continuing on. We appreciate you giving your input. That's a fine answer back too. But they felt safe sharing it. They felt seen. They felt respected in that. That was psychologically safe. And so it's just being able to, how do we practice seeing other people in that space? And the easiest way to do it is what I said at the beginning, is start asking people themselves and not allowing them to talk about work.
Well, I love that. and we can, this, a lot of it boils into communication skills too, right? And challenging us to rise to the occasion and figure out how not to ask the easy question that allows the superficial answer, so that we can get to know one another and support one another in different ways. And that alone feels a little less lonely and a little less, daunting at times. But the work that you're doing is important and, certainly valuable. We need more of it. So however I can support that, I am all ears and here for it. But hopefully some of our listeners will find you on, look, I put a third one, on your LinkedIn.
Amazing.
And so this is Trevor's LinkedIn details. You've got all of the places that you might be able to find him. But, I'm very impressed with what you're up to, and I appreciate your taking the time with us. Any finishing thoughts or words of wisdom or, mic drop moments that you have for us today?
I think the last thing is, so this can all feel daunting and really big, and waiting for someone else in the organization to do it and start having the conversation. But the easiest thing that someone can do when they roll out every single day is just slowly starting to showcase your own vulnerability to other people, whether it be to a friend online, whether it be over beers with your friend, like a buddy, whether it be in the bus, whether it be like wherever you are, like just slowly start chipping away, because that small thing will be meaningful for you, but all the other people you touch, it's the easiest thing to do. So that's my big takeaway, is just start practicing it really small, and then it becomes much easier and more regular.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Trevor. I very much appreciate your being here with us, and hopefully one of these days we can do a part 2. But for all of you, we will link Trevor's details in everything that goes out. We certainly would love for you guys to listen on all the places that you can find podcasts, YouTube, our website, but also leave a review. And if you have ideas for other content, we are all ears. So let us know what you'd like to talk about or what you'd like for us to talk about. So thank you very much for all being here, and we will talk to you soon. Have a wonderful day.